All right, terrific. So we'll make a start. So welcome everybody to the SCHADS Award Changes 2022 webinar. We've been really inundated with registrations for this event. Obviously, it's in our industry. It's been something that's been very topical. A lot of people are interested in what these changes are, and it hasn't allowed us a real lot of time to get our systems ready for these changes. So I'm sure you're all in the same boat and very curious to know what's required from an employee's perspective. So thanks again for taking time out of your day today, out of your busy schedules. Just a little bit about today. So every 4 years, modern awards go through a rigorous process of being reviewed. This year, it's the SCHADS Awards turn over those 4 years. And the changes that they've made are a result of what we call determinations. So determinations generally follow a very consultative process. So you can sort of liaise with Fair Work when they're suggesting these changes, just to make sure that all the stakeholders involved are weighing in on how to make conditions and clauses more fair and equitable. If you're attending this, you might be aware that these changes take effect from 1 July this year, like most other awards do with pay increases and pay condition changes. The goal of today's webinar is to give you guys a strong understanding of your rights and responsibilities as an employer to your employees if you're running a business that's covered by the SCHADS Award. So before we get into it, a few things to note, just housekeeping stuff, I suppose. As we're going through the seminar today, I know a lot of people have asked about recordings and slides. We will be sending both the slide and a link to the recording after the session. We have a webinar offer, so sort of stay around to the end so you can hear that offer and see if it applies to you. Q&A is something that we'd really like to do time permitted, but funnily enough, it's a good thing, but funnily enough, we actually have hundreds of people joining us today, and it probably may not be practical to get through all of your questions. So what we're going to do is give you guys a link where you can book us in for a demo after the session. You can have one-on-one Q&A sessions with that afterwards if that's something you like to do. So what are we going to cover off on today? We're going to go with firstly the new minimum engagement period that now applies to part-time employees. We're going to do changes to broken shift conditions. I can see changes to 24-hour care shifts is the third one. Fourth, we're going to look at newly created shifts called remote work shifts. So it's a new concept in the award. Fifth thing we got is changes to existing allowances and a few new allowances as well that apply. Sixth is changes to overtime rates. 7 is changes to recall to work overtime rates. And 8 are any changes to conditions and clauses relating to client cancellations. So I'm going to cover these off in as much detail as possible to help you give you guys a better understanding of each of these changes. However, this might not be possible because everyone's situation is a little bit different. So as I said, we will have Q&A if time permits, but most likely it'll be make available ourselves to you guys after the session through an online meeting. Okay. So before we get into it too much, a little bit about PayCat, who we are and what we do. So a quick introduction of PayCat myself. It was established back in 2018 to form a team of specialised cloud payroll professionals with a fairly unique set of expertise in payroll, cloud payroll technology, modern awards and EBAs. My name is Garth Bellick and I'm the founder of PayCat. And previous to PayCat, I had a few decades of experience as a chartered accountant, showing my age, working at places like PwC, PKF, and I actually had my own accounting firm at one stage as well. Also worked with KeyPay for 3 years directly as their implementation and compliance specialist. So behind the scenes, maintaining this award template. Okay, so let's get started. So the first change we're going to cover are the fact that part-time employees now must have a minimum engagement period. In other words, a minimum number of working hours for each of their shifts. This was previously only applicable to casual employees. So to be classified as a part-time employee under the SCHADS Award, you must be working fewer than 38 ordinary hours on a reasonably predictable basis. So reasonably the same every week. The engagement is now 3 hours for social and community services, except when undertaking disability services, and 2 hours for everyone else. So really it's the same and now in line with what casuals are doing before. Part-timers now apply to that as well. The amendment also applies to periods of work that form part of a broken shift. We're going to be looking at broken shifts in a little bit more detail today. Lastly, part-time employees who have worked beyond the guaranteed minimum hours of at least 12 months will be able to request an amendment for their employment agreement to increase their minimum contracted hours. So if you guys out there, what do you do now? So I would start consulting with your part-time employees to reach an agreement to vary any existing hours to the new minimum engagement period. This way, the transition will be smooth and one when the changes come into effect from 1 July. And if a part-time employee makes a request to increase their guaranteed hours of work, you must ensure that you respond within 21 days. And of course, an obvious thing is that when you're rostering your staff, make sure that you factor in that they require a minimum of 2 hours or 3 hours paid, depending on the circumstance. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at is changes to broken shifts. A broken shift is when a SCHADS employee works a shift within a 12-hour period, but it's broken up into one or more breaks in between. So I'm not talking about meal breaks, I'm talking about like gaps in the shift. Previously, you could roster an employee for a maximum of 3 periods of work, but now that's been capped to a maximum of 2 periods of work. So for example, if a support worker in the social and community services sector is rostered to work a shift on Wednesday, but that shift is broken up into, let's say, her first shift being 9 to 11 a.m., then a second shift being, say, between 5:30 and 8:30 p.m., this would be considered 2 separate periods. An employer and employee can agree for the employee to work broken shifts for these periods. You'll also need to make sure that you pay shift allowances depending on what type of shift they work, such as afternoon, night, or public holiday shifts. It's a highly complicated area and there are a lot of scenarios that might affect how much you pay your employees. But the general idea is that you now only roster for 2 periods of work rather than 3. Okay. And later we'll talk about the scenario where you do actually roster 3. Okay. So I'm going to hand things over to Blake Bennett. So Blake's our customer success manager here at Paycat, and he's going to go through and talk about 24-hour care shifts. So over to you, Blake.
Hi guys, I'm going to be talking you through the new rules around 24-hour care shifts.
Hey Blake, you just got your calendar up.
It's the wrong one.
Yep.
How's that?
That's better.
We're back on track. All right, everyone, I'm here to talk to you about 24-hour care shifts. 24-hour care shifts only apply to home care employees. Basically, an employer can only require an employee to work a 24-hour care shift if both parties agree. An employee is only required to work a 24-hour care shift if both parties agree to it. But during the shift, you must give the opportunity to sleep for a continuous 8 hours during the shift in their own separate bed with clean linen. They must also have access to facilities such as a kitchen and bathroom, along with free board and lodging for each night that they need to sleep over. You'll need to pay the employee at 155% for their 8 hours of work within this 24-hour period. However, in cases where they need to perform active work for more than 8 hours during this shift, that's when overtime will kick in. During weekdays and Saturdays, that's at time and a half for the first 2 hours and then double time thereafter. On Sundays, that's double time for any overtime worked. Public holidays are at the usual rate of double time and a half. It's worth noting, though, that employees can refuse to work more than 8 hours total during that 24-hour care shift if it is considered unreasonable. Next, we're going to have a talk about remote work shifts. Remote work shift clauses have been introduced as a result of COVID and the growth of general remote work. Just to be clear on the definition, it's basically work that's performed outside of a designated workplace, like at home. There are 2 primary minimum payments when it comes to remote work, depending on what period the remote work is being performed. A minimum of 15 minutes has to be paid if it's between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. It's a minimum of 30 minutes, though, if it's between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. However, if the remote work includes staff meetings or training, then it's a minimum of 1 hour instead. Anytime the employee works continuously beyond the minimum payment period, for example, if they performed an hour and 5 minutes, it will need to be rounded up to the nearest 15-minute increment. So in that example, it'd be a payment of 1 hour and 15 minutes. If there are cases where there are multiple instances of remote work performed in a day, you'll need to pay separate minimum payments each time remote work is triggered, unless it's within a minimum payment period. For example, if it's a minimum 1 hour period for staff training and they attend 2 staff training sessions within that hour, You just need to pay them the 1 hour once, not twice. You'll need to pay at your employee's minimum hourly rate, but there will be instances where you'll attract additional loading, such as remote work outside of a certain span of hours, doing overtime, or working on weekends or public holidays. You'll need to consult them on an award for these penalty rates, or better yet, automate these on a cloud payroll software like KeyPay, which we can help you configure and set up. Like anything else, your employees will also need to record these on a timesheet or in some sort of time and attendance system. Now I'm going to hand things over to Lydia, who's going to discuss with you changes to allowances.
Hi, I'm here to discuss changes and new allowances, more specifically the laundering, repair and on-call allowances. Now, allowances are based off the pay rate schedules, which will change from the 1st of July 2022. The changes to the laundering allowance. If an employee's clothing, other than a uniform, is soiled when working, they'll be entitled to this allowance. There are, however, certain conditions, including that the employee must advise you of the soiling as soon as practical and, if required, provide evidence. They must also have complied with relevant PPE requirements at the time of soiling to receive the allowance. The allowance is 32 cents per shift. There's also a new allowance, the repair allowance. This is where an employee's clothing, other than a provided uniform, is damaged, excluding normal wear and tear. If it requires repair or a full replacement, the employer must reimburse the employee for the reasonable cost incurred in repairing or replacing the clothing. However, the same conditions that apply to the laundering allowance apply here. The employee must advise the employer of the damage or soiling as soon as possible. If required, provide evidence. They must have complied with relevant PPE requirements at the time of damage and be eligible for the allowance. To be eligible for the allowance, the damage or soiling must not have been caused by the employee's negligence. There are also changes to the on-call allowance. An on-call allowance of 2% of the standard rate during on-call hours on weekends and 3.96% for weekend or public holidays is paid to the employees that are required to be on call. Lastly, as we covered earlier on regarding broken shift periods, broken shift allowances have also been adjusted. Basically, you will need to pay an allowance of 1.6% of the standard rate per broken shift if you roster an employee onto a 2 periods of broken shift. If it's 3 periods and the employee agrees, it'll be 2.25% of the standard rate per broken shift. Now on to overtime rate changes. Overtime rate changes will be broken up into full-time, part-time and casual employees, but it also depends on what duties they're fulfilling. For disability services, home care or daycare employees, the first 2 hours are at time and a half before bumping up to double time for shifts between Monday to Saturday. Sunday shifts are all double time, while public holiday shifts are double time and a half. For social and community service and crisis accommodation employees, it's 3 hours instead of 2 hours at time and a half before bumping up to double time for Monday to Saturday shifts. Sunday shifts and public holidays are at the same double time and double time and a half. For part-time and casual employees, this is based on whether overtime occurs on a per shift, per week, per fortnight, or outside their regular span hours basis. So if they've worked more than 38 hours a week or 76 hours a fortnight, depending on your pay cycle, each additional hour will be at time and a half if it's between Monday and Saturday. Double time on Sundays and double time and a half on public holidays. If they've worked more than 10 hours per day, then you'll need to pay them time and a half for the first 2 hours of overtime, and then that bumps up to double time for Mondays to Saturdays. Again, Sundays and public holidays are double time and a half. Lastly, if they're working overtime outside their regular hours, you'll need to pay them time and a half for the first 2 hours of overtime and then double time there after. Again, double time and a half for Sundays and public holidays. I'll be switching you over to Garth to talk about recall to work overtime.
Thanks very much, Lydia. Just give me one sec, guys. I'll just share my desktop.
I want you to click mute and stop video.
Okay, so we're now going to talk about recalling to work overtime. So if you need to recall your employees to work after they've left the workplace to do overtime, you need to make sure that you pay them a minimum of 2 hours for each time they're recalled. But you also need to be careful that if you do recall them and their task doesn't take 2 hours, you can't actually force them to stay and remain for those 2 hours. You'll need to release them and still pay them for the minimum of 2 hours. Client cancellations, I'm sure this is a wildly unpopular one for your type of business. So we're going to talk about two different scenarios here. Both scenarios involve when client cancellations within 7 days of a scheduled service. So a cancel service would also include any rescheduling. In the first scenario, for home care and disability businesses, you can redirect the employee to perform other work for the hours that are rostered if you want. The caveat here is that you still need to pay them the time they would have been paid if they performed the cancelled service, or the new work you've assigned them, whichever is the greater of the two. So let's say that I'd schedule them for work and I reassign them to a 2-hour shift instead of a 3-hour shift they're meant to work, they get paid for 3 hours. In scenario 2, you can simply cancel their shift or part of the affected shift if you have no other choice. But you still need to pay them what they would have received if it wasn't cancelled. There is a way to avoid this though, as long as you offer make-up time. There are some conditions you have to make sure that you meet, which include letting them know about the new make-up time within 7 days of notice or less. The new shift you offer must be within 6 weeks of that cancelled service. You need to consult with your employee first before you offer it. You don't have to place them in the exact shift or client, but you do need to put them in an area where they can competently perform a duty. And you'll need to ensure that they're paid the same or more compared to what they would have worked had they performed the cancelled service. So we're going to finish off by talking about systems a little bit. So before we take questions, I know a lot of people in the chat have asked us how to best manage these existing conditions and plus the existing conditions of the SCHADS award. I will say personally, by far and wide, the SCHADS award is probably one of the most complicated awards in Australia, if not the most complicated one. We get a huge volume of requests for SCHADS compared to any other award out there due to its complexity. So I wanted to take the opportunity to talk about KeyPay and for anyone who currently isn't using it. As I mentioned at the start of the webinar, I previously worked at KeyPay, and while we do work with other cloud payroll software, KeyPay for the SCHADS awards far and wide the most recommended and sought after software for the SCHADS business. It's because it's got a comprehensive set of features all rolled into the platform. So it means anything from workforce management to HR, payroll, time and attendance, all handled and processed. I've listed out the 4 biggest benefits on screen for what I think is applicable to the SCHADS award. This includes things like the ability to automate a lot of your HR and onboarding, real-time rostering, and I will mention at that point as well that it does play really nicely with existing rostering systems. So if you're using a piece of care management software external, it can still work really well with that through integration. And most importantly, it's an automation of your payroll. So all of the nuances of the SCHADS award, things like sleepover shifts and shift work and overtime and these new requirements that are coming in for broken shifts and all these things are all wrapped up into an automated platform that sort of gets SCHADS right. And from our investigations, we haven't found another platform in Australia at the moment that calculates it compliantly. You know, there are some that get close, but not quite right. So it's an incredibly powerful tool and something actually we use ourselves at PayCat internally for our payroll as well. So I mentioned a webinar offer at the start. If you guys are interested in changing payroll software and you commit to doing that before 30th of June this year, we're willing to provide to members of the webinar today 20% off your implementation fee for getting that across. But whether you engage us or not, you can still inquire with us about KeyPay without signing on. Prices are varied based on how many employees you have generally, so it's calculated based on your headcount. If you're interested in finding out how to work with us, we are going to send out an email to all the registered participants after this session. That's going to include the slide deck that we've gone through today, a copy of the recording, and information on how you can get in contact with us to book a demo to take advantage of that offer. So over to questions. Now you might, I don't know if you guys can see this number, but we've actually got something like, north of 250 people online at the moment. So I'm expecting a bombardment of questions. As I said before, I'm very happy to, mindful of time, happy to, if I don't get through anybody's questions today, book a one-on-one session with us. We'll take you through key pay and we're happy to answer any SCHADS questions that you have at that time. But we'll just go through a few at the moment. We'll do our best to go through and answer some of them. Client cancellation. So Megan at the moment has said client cancellations is a change if your employees are casual. As far as we're aware, it applies to all employees regardless of employment type. So casual, full-time, part-time. Okay. Sleepover shifts. Does sleepovers affect this? So Pamela, sorry, I'm answering Pamela's question here. If a sleepover ends at 6 a.m. the next day, and then they work another shift, is that considered a broken shift? As far as we're aware, that's considered a brand new shift. So a sleepover shift might have a shift worked on either side of it as well, like an active and a passive put together. And then you might start working in the following night or afternoon. That next night or afternoon is considered a brand new shift, not a broken shift. Is on-call considered remote work? That question from Brittany. That's a really good question. I don't think we probably know the answers to that one yet. I think they certainly, you would consider all on-call work remote work because we're sitting around waiting for a phone call to be called up and go to work, right? But because there's an on-call allowance and because there's on-call conditions that are based around that very specific scenario, I think on-call becomes something under an umbrella term that we call remote work. So I think it is remote work, but I think you wouldn't apply the remote work requirements. You'd apply the on-call allowance instead. Next question we've got is from Lynn. Lynn asks, if we have a minimum engagement period being 3 hours per day, how is that handled if the employee chooses not to accept the shift? So we are talking about a per shift thing. So if it's a binary decision, do I work that shift or don't I? Then if they don't get paid anything. But if you offer them a shift of say 2.5 hours and that's all you offered them and they only took up, they decided to not take that shift up, you're not required to pay them 3 hours. It's only if they work 2.5 hours and they're meant to get 3 that you add the additional hour. So if the combined number of shifts, let's say offered them 2 shifts, 1.5 hours each, and they only took up 1 and not the other, yes, we'd be required to pay the minimum of 3 hours. So it's, I appreciate that sounds a little bit unfair, but unfortunately that's how the award's designed. Current work and direct support for community access. Staff can be rostered for many shifts throughout the day. Most range from 2 hours plus. Thanks, Diane. I probably can't pick up on a question there, but I guess that's probably, for community access, you'd fall under social and community services, that part of the award. So when we're talking about broken shifts, we did do that scenario on the slides where if you did 3 or more broken shifts in the day, which is sort of outside what the award wants you to do, there's a special allowance to pay that's a little bit higher than if you only did 2. Okay. Nene asks, client cancellation scenario. Does this only apply to the part-time or contracted hours only? What if they agreed to take up extra hours for a particular week? And is it then cancelled by a client? So in your scenario, that's a scenario too that we looked at in the slides, and I think that would apply to whether they've cancelled a shift and we've offered make-up time. So if you've offered make-up time and you dealt with the requirements of that, of offering make-up time, as in it's been agreed with by the employee and everything, I think you're okay. You just have to assess whether or not the original shift that you offered that got cancelled versus the shift that you offered for make-up time, they get paid the higher of the two. So if I originally offered 2 hours and the make-up time was for 3 hours, you get paid 3. Okay. All right. What happens? What happens in SO turn into? Okay. What happens if a sleepover turns into an active night shift? Do we have to pay the shift allowance? You're probably describing something where you are getting up and you're performing work during a sleepover shift. So this is where you've been assigned a sleepover shift. You wake up, you work during the sleepover, and then you might go back to bed. So there's 2 things that apply. It gets treated as overtime, that part of that sleepover shift. You still get your sleepover allowance, but the part that you work has to be paid at overtime for a minimum of 1 hour. Okay, next question we've got is from Julie. Allowances for home care staff. Are staff to be paid time and kilometres to travel between 2 shifts? That one has some nuance to it. So it does for some sectors, not others, Julie. So that might be one that we might need to discuss offline one-on-one. So when that email comes through, just book a session. We'll go through the different travel requirements. Penny asks, what if you have employees covered by the SCHADS for some work and then an EA for others? In relation to pay cap being able to interpret? It's a really good question. So we do get a lot of EA stands for Enterprise Bargaining Agreement. So this is where there's a registered agreement between you, the employer, and Fair Work and the employees. And that will supersede what happens in the SCHADS award. So we get situations where a client might use both. And we build the logic of that EBA so you get the same benefit as what you would get if you just use a SCHADS award. In other words, if I set up an employee under an EBA and they put timesheets in, it's going to get costed and interpreted based on those EBA requirements. Okay, question from Julie. For home care staff, does this now mean that a casual worker can only be scheduled for 2 shifts per day, i.e. a 2-hour domestic shift and then a 2-hour social support shift? That's the way I read it. We dealt with in the slides that if you do more than 2 shifts, that you have to pay a higher allowance. It's about 2.25 times the standard rate. So it does deal with situations where you do want to give them more than 2 shifts, but it's encouraging you to leave it to 2 shifts a day. Rosalind asks, how long would you expect to take a complete payroll NDIS with 40 employees using KeyPay? Good question. So we very rarely get, if you're purely complying with the award and you're using either the timesheeting software inside of KeyPay or you're bringing in your data from a supported care management software outside of KeyPay, you'll find that the payroll process itself probably takes an hour or less per week. Okay, got an anonymous question. I don't understand the shift cancellation. Our participants rarely ever cancel 7 days in advance. I'm a small business and can't pay support workers for not working. I have a 24-hour cancellation rule, but I don't have cover shifts to make up the hours of cancellation. What happens now? All my employees are casual. I think it's probably more a complaint than a question, and I definitely feel the pain. There's probably the practical answer is change your policy to be a 7-day cancellation policy, not a 24-hour one. But the likelihood is that after these changes occur, you might find that the NDIS pricing schemes update to reflect these changes as well. So you might end up getting the opportunity to charge for cancelled shifts from a client. Now I'm only speculating here. I don't know for sure. But yeah, I certainly see the financial penalty involved here, but you know, our job on this webinar is really to show you and interpret the rules, but certainly from a, you know, a fairness standpoint, I completely get where you're coming from. Okay, on-call allowance. So this from Michaela. Employees receive an on-call allowance for the days they're required to be available, answer calls. When they take a call, this is classified as remote work or overtime. Yeah, so it would be called, that's a great point. You would consider it to be remote work. You'd consider it to be remote work, like you've been called up from an on-call scenario and you're working remote work. Your second question was overtime. When calculating overtime after 76 hours a fortnight, do you include all hours of work Monday to Sunday, excluding overtime already incurred? 100% correct. That's exactly what you do. And thirdly, is overtime on Sundays on top of the Sunday rate, or is it in substitution for it? It's in substitution for it. So it's not compounding. So, you know, if we normally pay, say, double time on a Sunday, the overtime rate's double time of base rates, not double time of your Sunday rate. What will happen with support coordinators? Support coordinators do still fall under this award, under the same set of rules. So the same logic would apply to them. Suzanne asked, does KeyPay integrate well with Brevity Care software? Yes, we have clients at the moment that use Brevity. Brevity produce a nice spreadsheet export of the timesheets that come out, and we're able to import those timesheets into KeyPay once a week without any manipulation. So yeah, good choice of software to integrate with. Okay, we'll probably take 3 more questions, then we might have to wrap things up. So Gemma has asked if somebody's working in the community and they have 4 rostered shifts for the day, is that classified as broken shifts? So 8 to 9, 11 to 12, 2:30 to 3:30, and 4 to 6. So I would say that you've probably, with that set of timing, you've probably got 3, not 4. You probably could justify that 2:30 to 3 and then 4 to 6 is 1 shift with a meal break. But certainly the 3 parts there sort of that I would say would be 8 to 9 would be your first shift, 11 to 12 would be your second, and 2:30 to 6 p.m. would be your third with a meal break. Okay, I've got a question from Katie. Does the NDIS price guide reflect a 24-hour cancellation policy, not a 7-day? Or is it being updated in the price guide? Now, I must apologise that the NDIS price guide is certainly not my area of expertise. It is very much limited to payroll. But what we do know about the NDIS price guide is all of their billing and financial modelling is based on what a markup on what they'd expect the payroll cost to be. So we're definitely expecting, if it hasn't happened already, you know, the federal election might have delayed it, but we are expecting them to review that and update it in the coming, you know, number of weeks or months. So can't speak to it at the moment, but yeah, we're hoping to see that changes to reflect a 7-day cancellation policy. And I'll take this one as a last question. Allowances for home care staff are staff to be paid time and kilometres to travel between 2 shifts. I think I might have just double upped on this one. Yeah, just let me know about that one privately, because it does change based on circumstance. I'll just find one last question for you guys and we'll wrap things up. Jennifer Baker asked, minimum hour shifts, no breaks. And do broken shifts with loading equal the minimum hours a part-timer can work? Yeah, so they would. If I achieved, when we're talking about minimum times for casuals and part-timers, like soon to be part-timers, we're talking about how much time they work in a day. And minimum hour shifts, no breaks. The break rule would usually applies to a shift that's gone longer than 5 hours. So you've got an obligation after 5 hours to write that shift. Okay, so on that note, guys, once again, thank you so much for joining. I really hope that you guys keep an eye out for that email and take advantage of that webinar offer to get you guys functional on KeyPay, so you can get this stuff sorted out. Good luck. Keep in touch with us as this rolls out and you're changing your systems, and very much hope to see you on the next webinar we do. Thanks for coming.